Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And my topic for tonight is Crisis and Climbdown and Pepe's Big Picture. So, two topics I want to talk about tonight. Sorry, I didn't intend to black that out. I intend to go to the comments, of which there are none yet. So, hey, Lisa, how are you? Thank you for coming. Okay, so what happened over the weekend is that this continuing chatter by powers of the collective West, specifically Macron and France, and the English, as well, there was a lot of talk about sending NATO troops into Ukraine because the Ukraine military has been collapsing now for some time, as the Russians continue with their very successful war of attrition. More and more of the Ukrainians are being killed every day or every week. The numbers are rising very alarmingly, and the Ukrainians don't have anything to replace them with. Hiya, Steve. How you doing? And the West is starting to become panicked. Over the weekend, Hakeem Jeffries also made something about the war in Ukraine. He made a comment that from the standpoint of the kind of rhetoric the ideologists are using here, may have seemed fairly routine to most of us, but it was interpreted by the Russians, as indicating that, well, the U.S. was thinking about sending troops also. And so the Russians over the weekend responded in a very vigorous way, over the weekend and on Monday. The first I got a glimmer of this was in Judging Freedom. The Judge Napolitano show, during the weekly appearance of Scott Ritter, on that particular show. And I'm going to bring that up for you here, and we'll look at a few parts of it, and you'll see what I mean. There we are. So you should be seeing Scott Ritter now. I'll play a few minutes with some interruptions of what Scott has to say.
Running out of patience, or will he continue his methodical war of attrition no matter?
The he, which the judge is referring to here, is, of course, Vladimir Putin.
What Emmanuel Macron says, no matter what David Cameron threatens, no matter what Tony Blinken promises.
I think we need to understand one fundamental truth here, that this conflict is seen by Russia as an existential conflict, that there is no tie, there is no defeat, there is only victory. And they have put together a plan to achieve that victory. And they're on the cusp of that happening right now. As we speak, the Ukraine.
Okay, so just in those few words, I think Scott has very well summarized, the situation there. The purpose of the war in Ukraine, which was provoked by the United States, was not an unprovoked war. It was definitely provoked. But the purpose of provoking that war and then fighting that war was to try to come to a situation where the regime of Vladimir Putin would be undermined and some replacement would rise, in Russia. And what the West was hoping for was that such a replacement would be similar to Yeltsin, and then the West was pointing towards becoming successful in trying to break up the Russian Federation. Those were the objectives of the United States and the members of the collective West in this. So Putin rightly perceived that this war and the provocations were an existential threat to the Russian Federation as it's now constituted, not just to his regime, but to the Russia he had worked so hard to build up since he took over in 1999, if memory serves me correctly. It might have been 98. Anyway.
Ukrainian army is disintegrating at the front. This is sending, waves of panic through NATO, et cetera. And this is why you see, Emmanuel Macron talking about the need to send French troops if the Ukrainian line collapses. Well, it's collapsing right now. David Cameron making similar statements. Russia has a plan. They have mobilized the troops. They have trained the troops. They have the conventional military to achieve this objective. As I was told by a general earlier this year, major changes on the map in May and probably game over by the end of the summer. And that's the.
So you heard it. That's what one of the major generals of Russia, is saying. So
the trajectory they're on. The problem is you have the West saying insane things, such as if the Ukrainian line collapses, NATO troops will intervene. This is why Vladimir Putin now has ordered the Southern Military District. People, please just open your eyes and your ears and listen to what I'm saying. The Southern Military District to carry out training for the employment of tactical nuclear weapons.
Now, I have to say that there was some talk of tactical nuclear weapons months and months ago, during the war. Scott said at that time that the Russians did not really make the distinction between strategic military weapons and tactical military weapons. They didn't have any tactical military weapons in the same sense as we had them. So now Russia's talking about training people in the use of tactical military weapons. So what are these? These are low yield types of nuclear weapons. But according to some things I've read, they're 20 times the power of the atomic bombs used at Hiroshima. 10 times. I'm getting confused. The bombs at Hiroshima, and Nagasaki were equivalent to 20,000 tons, of TNT. These are reportedly 10 times as explosive as that. So each of them would be 200,000 tons, of TNT. That seems to me to be more than simply tactical, but okay. The Russians were not earlier threatening to use that. What they were saying is if such weapons were used against them, they were going to retaliate at that point. But they never said that, you did say they would use them if they perceived an existential threat. Now let's go on.
This doesn't mean that they're going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They're not.
That's the point. They're not going to use them in Ukraine. They're not going to restrict them to Ukraine.
They're going to blow the hell out of NATO forces in Romania, Poland, Germany, France, Italy. It's nuclear war. If this is what you want, West, you're going to get it. Putin doesn't bluff. This ain't a game. This isn't joke. This is life and death for Russia. They've made that clear from the very beginning. And so now we have a situation where NATO tried to call us bluff. The United States poured hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weaponry and money and such into the Ukrainian military. Russia had a plan. They ground it out. All this nonsense you hear in the West. Russia's suffering 1,000 dead. The number of Russian losses right now on the battlefield are the lowest they've been since the war started. That's how unbalanced this is right now. Russia is dominating the front line. They are devastating the Ukrainians. It was 800 Ukrainian dead a week ago. It was 1,000 earlier. It's up to 1,500 a dead. They're just being slaughtered. They're being annihilated. And they're
Didn't he say 1,500 a day? That's a huge casualty rate. A huge casualty rate. Even 1,500 a week is a huge casualty rate. 1,500 a week is what? 75,000 fatalities per year? Whoa.
There's nothing to replace them. So they are literally collapsing. NATO's in a panic. Macron's talking about sending troops. Poland's talking about sending troops. And Russia's saying, I don't know how many times we have to tell you, if NATO troops show up on Ukrainian soil, we're going to nuke you.
So there's the plain message. The plain message. Now,
we're going to nuke you. Okay, we're going to take you out, not your troops in Ukraine. We're going to nuke the decision-making centers. Russia isn't bluffing. I hope the people watching right now are getting cold sweats right now because the world's over at this point, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, it's over. It's game, set, match. It's done. Whatever plans you had for the summer, they're canceled.
I don't know why Scott is smiling about that. Okay, exactly. He seems to revel in actually delivering the message. In just a moment, we will consider how the message was delivered. It isn't clear from what he's saying.
Whatever Christmas plans you had, forget about it. So get scared, start calling people and saying, what the hell are you doing, Tony Blinken? Biden, get on the phone to Macron and tell him to shut up and sit down. The same thing with the Poles, because this is it. Russia's getting ready to exercise the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the southern military district. Okay, that means that if NATO troops are deployed, because the Ukrainian army is collapsing as we speak. And
okay, they're doing training in the southern military district, which is the district that has responsibility of for the war in Ukraine. Yes, but they're not going to exercise these weapons. They're not going to use these weapons inside of Ukraine. They said that already. They're going to use them in the rest of Europe.
And Macron has said it's his red line. And if they collapse, I have no choice, he says, but to send French troops in. Well, the Russians will kill them, but then they're going to nuke France. So there we are. This is about as serious as it gets, and yet we are sleepwalking. We are sound asleep. Nobody in America cares. Nobody.
Okay, so that's enough of Scott. Okay, on that. Okay, I saw that actually last night. Wasn't sure what to think about it. Okay, exactly. I got some more information on it today. And that brings us to, well, let me share this on Facebook before I go much further. Let me bring this to you. God. Doesn't want to cooperate very much. Here we go. Okay, I just thought I'd share it myself. Kind of help a little bit. So, oh, Jeff Denton's here too. Hiya, Jeff. Nice to see you. So, let's see. So then I got some more information today. Kept looking for it. Of course, it was right in what I, usually look at. Okay, the Duran, did a show. And a more detailed show, okay, was done, okay, by Alexander Mercouris talking about this as well. But it's enough for us to look at a few minutes, okay, of Duran, which actually the Duran show with the two of them was unusually long today at 46 minutes and 15 seconds. They usually don't do shows, okay, as long, okay, as that. But we'll look at a few minutes of this also. And see what we learn. That should be showing up on your screens. Let me double check that. Yes, it is showing up on your screens. So let me play that a little bit.
A statement. House Democrat Minority Leader Jeffries' statement about Ukraine and boots on the ground and pro-Putin forces in the U.S. Congress. So where should we begin? Because
Well,
there's a lot of ground that we need to cover.
I think we need to cover the ground of the last couple of days because this has been a momentous series of days. And yesterday was, in some respects, a terrifying day. Now, I say all of that. Note that the media, the mainstream establishment legacy media, is barely covering any of the things we're going to talk about now. Let's start where it started. It kicked off with two articles written by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times, one on the 28th of April, one a couple of days late, I think on the 4th of May. The one on the 28th of April was about NATO flooding Ukraine with so-called advisors who are going to be, in fact, special forces troops who are supposed to be fighting the Russians in Ukraine. And Stephen Bryan made some comparisons between that and the war in Vietnam, where exactly the same thing happened. The United States prepared the way for the intervention of its ground forces, official intervention of its ground forces in the war in Vietnam by first sending so-called advisors who were really special forces combat troops. And Stephen Bryan, who I ought to say is somebody who has worked in the US government, he's a very serious man. He's somebody who should be taken extremely seriously. He's a critic of the Ukraine war, but he's someone also with good contacts in Washington and the intelligence community and the national security, world. So he's somebody who is well sourced about what he's saying. Anyway, Stephen Bryan said that there's now strong possibility that after the election, if he's re-elected, President Biden will formally sign off on intervention by US ground forces in Ukraine. And then a couple of days later, we had a second article for Stephen Bryan. Now, note that in neither of these articles does Stephen Bryan gives links to his sources, but I'm confident that he's not just making all this up. Anyway, he said that France had officially sent troops to Ukraine. These were the French Foreign Legion, a regiment of the French Foreign Legion, 1,500 men, is being dispatched to Ukraine, and an advance party of 100 troops has already arrived in Ukraine, in Slavyansk, which is in one of the key towns.
So we should emphasize the French Foreign Legion is distinguished, of course, from the regular army. But these are people still under the supervision of the regular French army and still paid by the French army, even though they're not the regular troops of the French army. So pretty serious to send 100 members of the Foreign Legion to Ukraine, okay, to fight, and for them to be an advance guard for 1,500 such troops, okay, to be sent. Okay, also Alex takes this guy, Stephen Bryan, very seriously. He also says he doesn't know Alex. He doesn't know Stephen Bryan, but he's evidently been reading his stuff for some time and respects him as someone who would, not invent a story. So should emphasize that.
Still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. And these troops are going into Ukraine specifically again to fight the Russians. This is a combat deployment. So
this is pretty insane, because the French army is pretty small. Okay. The Russians have now expanded their military forces to 1.3 million people. I don't think the French, with all the extensions of forces to other areas, in France itself, I'd be surprised if there were more than 150,000 troops. That's just an estimate off the top of my head, but I think it's probably in the ballpark. And how many troops the French could possibly get to Ukraine to help? I doubt that could exceed 15,000, but I'll go on now.
those are those two articles by Stephen Bryan. At the same time, we had statements by David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister, that Ukraine is free to use any weapons that Britain gives it in whatever way it chooses, which of course implied that Ukraine is free to use its Storm Shadow missiles to launch strikes inside what even Britain recognizes as Russian territory.
Now that is a very serious statement, and that is absolutely nuts, because if that were to occur, then the Russians would have every right to declare war on Britain. I mean, giving permission for Ukraine to use British weapons to attack the main area for Russia. We're not talking about the Novorossiya area now, which Russia has annexed. We're talking about the parts of Russia before the invasion going on.
So, really disturbing information. Troop deployments by France, troop deployments ultimately by the United States in the form of advisors, suggestions that after the election, the United States is going to formally declare an intervention of some kind in Ukraine, and words from David Cameron about missile strikes on Russian territory. And then shortly after that, we got Hakeem Jeffries, the major Democrat in the House of Representatives, the leading Democrat in the House of Representatives, making some extraordinarily strong and abusive comments about Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Republicans, but also saying we've got to fight the Russians, we've got to defeat the Russians in Ukraine, because if we don't, if Ukraine isn't able to defeat the Russians and its front lines collapse, then the United States' own military might have to fight the Russians itself. It was slightly ambiguous language, wording that he used, but it did seem to be, when you look at it with all of the other things, again, softening us up, preparing us for the possibility that there's going to be a US military intervention in Ukraine.
Now, of course, that is what we have to note about this, is that before the passage of the $61 billion aid package, Hakeem Jeffries wasn't saying anything like that. He waited until after the passage of the aid package. if he was really thinking that there might have to be intervention by the U.S., there should have been a debate about that before the package was passed. Also, as far as I know, this stuff, what you're seeing now, isn't being covered in the mainstream press. It's being covered in, the alternative media, which of course is doing a very good job of covering it. But that's not really the point. The three major cable networks are not getting this news to the American people at this point, that its government is contemplating seriously an intervention in Ukraine right after the election if Joe Biden should happen to win. The mainstream press doesn't want us to know that our vote, that who we vote for, in the election, is perhaps going to determine whether or not we intervene with our military inside, of Ukraine. Why don't they want us to know it? Because they know that would predispose a lot of people to vote for Trump, who are now considering voting for Biden. Because the American people don't want the United States to go to war in Ukraine. They've been fine with supporting the Ukrainians. But one of the whole points of this was to have the Ukrainians fight the Russians so we wouldn't have to. And here our people are starting to say, well, we might have to go in there and intervene to save the Ukrainians. What nonsense is this?
So the Russians see all of this and they react massively. I mean, there is a huge Russian reaction that played out over the course of yesterday. So firstly, we had an announcement that the Russian Defense Ministry is beginning drills with tactical nuclear weapons. And the statement from the Russian Defense Ministry says that this is being done specifically in connection with these provocative statements by Western officials. And it's clear that it's Macron, who's been talking about interventions in Ukraine. It is David Cameron about the missile strikes in Ukraine. I think we have to throw in Hakim Jeffries as well. So anyway, first of all, tactical nuclear weapons. And then shortly after, we get news that the French and British ambassadors have been summoned to the foreign ministry. And they're both given a massive dressing down when they arrive there. Now, we don't know exactly what the Russians said to the French, but we do know how the French responded. Firstly, the Élysée Palace denies that there are any French troops in Ukraine. Secondly, the Élysée Palace says that France is not at war with Russia or with the Russian people. Thirdly, the Élysée Palace says that they recognize Putin as the president of Russia and they have no intention of achieving regime change in Russia. And then they also say that they're going to send their ambassador, the French ambassador, to attend Putin's inauguration today. So that's France.
So that's France. And that's the Climbdown. The Climbdown by Le Petit Roi, the little king, specifically Macron. That's the Climbdown. The Russian bear growled and the little king climbed down.
All the signs are a big climb down from France. We don't know how the British have reacted to the meeting between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the British ambassador. There's been no word from London And with the exception of one article in The Guardian, no reporting of any of these events in Moscow or of any of this, the fact that the British ambassador was called in. The entire British media is preserving complete silence on this. The one article in The Guardian was completely factual, very unusual. But the Russian
It's very unusual for the Guardian to be completely factual. I find that hilarious.
Foreign Ministry has told us what they said to the British ambassador. They said, if British missiles are launched against Russian territory, the Russians will consider Britain is directly involved in the war in Ukraine, and the Russians then reserve the right to retaliate against British military installations and bases in Britain itself, and to go after the British military everywhere else in the world.
Well, that's pretty tough talk. It's very definite, leaves no ambiguity. No ambiguity. They've told Britain what they are going to do. They told France what they're going to do also, which was pretty much the same thing.
I mean, incredibly strong. So the British, they received this. I mean, it's not a warning, it's an ultimatum. Radio silence from London. And then we have other countries starting to weigh in. First, Poland says that they're not going to send troops to Ukraine and have no plans to do so. Italy, which has been unhappy about Macron's statements for some time, also weighs in. They say that they have no plans to send troops to Ukraine. And in fact, they go even further. They say it's completely ruled out. And they also say, by the way, that the sanctions have failed. This is the Italian Defense Ministry, that there needs to be negotiations. First time Italy has spoken in those terms. And then the United States finally weighs in. It says that they recognize Putin as the president of Russia. So they're not seeking regime change in Russia. You can believe that or not as you please. There will be no American troops sent to Ukraine. You can believe that or not as they please, but that is what they said. So, a crumbling of the West in the face of an incredibly strong Russian response to these articles published by Stephen Bryan and to Macron's statements, Hakim Jeffrey's statements, and all of those. Now, I'm going to say this. I come back to Stephen Bryan. I am convinced he definitely had sources for what he wrote. I think what the Western powers were doing is they were floating trial balloons. They were testing the waters, partly with the Russians, partly with their own populations, their own voters, starting to prepare the ground for some kind of military intervention in Ukraine. And the Russians, however, reacted with incredible force, and they're now in full-scale retreat. Are the French troops in Ukraine? Almost certainly. Are they there officially? Probably. But I suspect that the French are going to call off, for the moment at least, the major the plan, any plan that they had of announcing the fact that those troops were there. We're going to go back to the fiction that these are mercenaries or contractors, that kind of thing. And once again, this attempt to get it slightly over, the horizon that these troops were there, they're going to go underground again. And that's what happened yesterday. Really big news. Russians calling the West's bluff. But please remember, what the West doesn't want, what the United States doesn't want, is a major crisis with threats of use of nuclear weapons before the presidential election in November.
I think Alexander is quite right about that. Who knows what may happen after November, as he will say, in just a minute. But for the moment, what happened is the Russians acted according to the proverb of the Arabs, the famous proverb. When the camel puts his or her nose, in the tent, you slap it away. Because if you don't slap it away, that camel is going to be in the tent. And that's exactly what the Russians were doing here, forcefully slapping the nose of the camel out of the tent.
If Biden is re-elected in November, the mood may shift, the situation may change. And all of these ideas, which seem to have been shelved for the moment, might be revived again. But an extraordinary day yesterday, a nail-biting day, and the fact that there's this echoing silence about it across the mainstream media in the West in itself tells you that something very big happened.
Yeah, I wonder what the Russian foreign ministry told the UK ambassador and the French ambassador. Boy, yeah, what an incredible day yesterday. One of the indications that the UK may be backing down, Alexander, is stories that came up this morning. I don't know if you caught any of them at the time of recording this video. I'm not sure when we'll publish this video, but this morning we had stories talking about how the Crimea Bridge is not a military target. Let me just read you a title from the Independent, independent.co.uk. I believe they're the first ones that ran with this story. Satellite images show Russia no longer using Crimean Bridge to supply troops in Ukraine. That's not coincidence, is it?
No, it's not coincidence at all. And it sort of hints at any plan to go after the Crimean Bridge, at least for the moment, at least today, maybe, which is the day of, well, it's an important day in Russia. At least at the moment, that's been called off. And it is not a coincidence because
the important day in Russia today was that, it's Victory Day, for the Russians. And it was also, the inauguration of Putin for his new term. And by the way, he is said to have given a very fiery speech. I haven't had a chance to cover the speech as yet, but I believe it contained very strong warnings towards the West to stop its messing with the Russians. I'm not exactly sure, of the details, but I'm sure it was very, very strong, very definite, in line with the warnings that we've seen here.
I suspect that the Russians gave the British specific warnings in connection with any planned attacks on the Crimean Bridge. So it's been well known for many months that the Russians are not using the Crimean Bridge for military logistics purposes, that military logistics go to Crimea through the railway lines that the Russians have built across the land corridor from Russia through Donbass and Zaporozhye region into Crimea. So this is nothing new. But that article in the Independent gives every impression of having been planted. It's a sign that London is also backing down. And the fact they chose the Independent, by the way, is in itself important because the Independent is a mainstream broadsheet newspaper, but it's smaller than the others. It's not quite as big as the Guardian, Times, or the Financial Times, or the Telegraph. It's also much, much newer. And it's a way of making this statement in a serious way. Is going to be read by serious people, by the political class in London. But at the same time, by running this story in the Independent, you're also avoiding giving it too much attention because it's not a newspaper with an enormous international or even British readership, which is again consistent with the whole policy of keeping this story as quiet as possible.
Yeah, well, the Kiev Independent, the Kiev Post, they did pick it up and they
Of
ran
course they
with
did.
it.
Well, that's
So
Ukraine.
I think that yeah, exactly. So I think that tells you that could be the Kiev Independent, Kiev Post also signaling to the Zelensky regime, back off with the Crimea bridge stuff for now. I mean, everything can change in 24 hours,
Absolutely.
48 hours, who knows? But for now, it does seem like these warnings and this ultimatum that the Russians gave to France and to the UK is working. For now, we always have to say that because, you know, who knows? But maybe the story in Asia Times, maybe the goal of that story was to try and not only see Russia's reaction, but to try and push through another Russian red line, because the collective West does have this sense, this belief that Russia's red lines can be thrown out, can be passed at any time, and Russia's continuously putting down red lines, but they never act on the red lines.
I don't know why the West would still believe that, because when Russia came into the war, it was quite clear that it acted to produce the invasion in response to the West crossing a red line. The Russians had warned them to back off. Joe Biden just ignored them, would not answer the proposals, of Putin, would not at all talk about it. And Putin did what he said he would do. He invaded. After that invasion, I can't see how people would believe that Russia doesn't do what they say they're going to do.
And to an extent, I mean, Russia's never specifically said what those red lines are. I mean, to be honest, Russia has never said this is a red line, that's a red line. The West defines red lines. Throughout the last 2 years, they've put down these Putin red lines, even though these weren't Russia's red lines. They attribute them to Putin. And then they pass the red lines. You know, ATACMS are a red line, and we're going to send ATACMS to Ukraine, even though Putin never said ATACMS are a red line. He's warned against them, but he's never said if you send ATACMS is a red line. So maybe a part of this article that may have been fed to Asia Times. I agree with you. This was probably fed to Asia Times, even though there are French troops in Ukraine. I don't think anyone denies that. Call them mercenaries, call them French Foreign Legion, whatever. Maybe part of this was to see if they can break through another red line that they have defined, which is troops getting to the front line, Slavyansk. I mean, we're talking front line of the action, and you're having French military there. I mean, what do you think about that?
That is exactly what the Russians thought, which is why they reacted in the way that they did. They saw that the West was, in fact, testing their red lines. Now, their red lines obviously consist of ground troops. They've said many times that Western ground troops enter Ukraine, they will be attacked by the Russian military. They undoubtedly made that clear yesterday over the course of their meeting with the French ambassador. And they also made clear to the French ambassador that if that required Russia using tactical nuclear weapons, they would do it. So they've asserted their red line there. Now, you're absolutely correct about weapons deliveries. The Russians have never at any time said the delivery of any specific type of conventional weapon, not nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons are clear red lines, but they've never said that any conventional weapon supplied by the West to Ukraine is a red line. They've never said that HIMARS, M777s, Abrams tanks, ATACMS missiles are a red line. But Putin has said recently that if there are missile strikes with Western missiles on legally recognized Russian territory, Western countries should be aware that the Russians have the similar capability to launch missile strikes on the territories of Western countries that have supplied those missiles. Now, that was, to my mind, that was a clear warning and a sign of a red line. Now, the Russians reaffirmed that yesterday in the strongest terms. So again, they undoubtedly saw this as testing a red line, and they asserted again very strongly and very vigorously their red lines. I'm convinced that is what those Asia Times articles were. I mean, I should make it clear. I think that Stephen Bryan, who I by the way, I've never had any contact with, but Stephen Bryan is a serious person. I am convinced that he was writing in complete good faith. He was undoubtedly being fed this information by some very senior sources, and the intention was to see how the Russians would react to the challenging of their red lines. That was what the Stephen Bryan articles were all about. That was what the David Cameron comments were all about as well. And as I said, the Russians came down incredibly hard. I mean, they came down with a sledgehammer. And I think the West has been stunned, actually, by the Russian reaction. I think that they probably expected strong protests from the Russians, public protests. They perhaps didn't fully expect their ambassadors to be called in and lectured in this very, very tough way. And as you said, one would have loved to have been a fly on the wall over the course of those meetings. And of course, they certainly didn't expect the nuclear weapons drills, which were clearly done in order to reinforce the message that was given to the ambassadors. By the way, it is a certainty that the Russians have also been in touch with the United States. And note that today, the US ambassador is going back to the United States. We're not told that the ambassador is going for consultations with the US government, but one suspects that the ambassador is carrying a message from the Kremlin. There's a very, very strong message from the Kremlin. So a lot was going on yesterday. By the way, the other thing that was undoubtedly going on yesterday was that the phone lines between the Western capitals must have been buzzing. There will have been lots of people phoning each other, lots of anxious and worried conversations going on. Macron having to deal at the same time with the fact that he's in meeting with Xi Jinping, which must have made the whole situation even more awkward. And of course, he knows he's been humiliated, which he has been, by the way. And he's been humiliated even whilst Xi Jinping is there, present physically in Paris, in his capital. But there will have been phone calls, messages sent.
Okay, there's lots of other good stuff, but we have to move on now to the rest of the stream, other subjects of the stream. But I think the main message, okay, that you get is that there was a trial balloon testing the reaction of Russia. The reaction of Russia was very strong and was underlined by the order to the troops of the 27th district, the southern district, okay, of Ukraine, to begin training using tactical nuclear weapons. So, of course, that's very, very frightening. The Russians intended it to be frightening. They wanted the West to take their warnings very, very seriously. And the warnings were very, very specific. So, it looks like there's been a climb down. It looks like a developing crisis that very few people knew about or talked about was over. Now let us get to some of the bigger pictures. Hi, is this live? Just now able to log in. Greetings, everyone. Yes, Andy. it's been live. It's been live, right? And there's been a lot to it as well. Now, though, I'm going to move on to a new piece by Pepe Escobar on his perceptions of some part of the bigger picture, and I have two things to talk about here. One is the article by Pepe Escobar, and the other is a video that appeared this morning on the Dialogue Works channel, okay, of Nima Al-Khurshid, where he conducted a lengthy interview, okay, with Pepe Escobar on his perceptions, okay, of the world situation, okay, in general, where Pepe goes continent by continent through what the situation is in terms of the competition between, okay, the collective West on the one hand and the BRICS nations on the other. But let's first go to Pepe's contribution to thecradle.com. The Russia-Iran-China search for a new global security order is what the article was about. And that was done on May 3rd, 2024. And there's a graphic in the background of armed troops and missiles and maps. And in the foreground, there are pictures of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and also the president of Iran, Raisi. And the photo credit is to the Cradle. The article, which I'll now go through. The article has no idea what awaits the exceptionalist mindset. China has started to decisively stir the civilizational cauldron without bothering about an inevitable array of sanctions coming by early 2025 and or a possible collapse of the international financial system. Last week, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, I think actually it's Anthony Blinken, but okay, and his list of delusional U.S. demands was welcomed in Beijing by Foreign Minister Wang Yi and President Xi Jinping as little more than an annoying gnat. Wang, on the record, stressed that Tehran was justified in defending itself against Israel's shredding of the Vienna Convention when it attacked the Iranian consulate in Damascus. At the UN Security Council, China now openly questions not only the state terror attack on the Nord Streams, but also the U.S.-Israel combo's blocking of Palestinian statehood. Moreover, Beijing, just like Moscow recently, hosts Palestine's political factions together in a conference aiming to unify their positions. Next Tuesday, only 2 days before Moscow celebrates Victory Day, the end of the Great Patriotic War, Xi will land in Belgrade to remind the whole world about the 25th anniversary of the bombing of the Chinese embassy by the US, UK, and NATO. Russia, meanwhile, provided a platform for the UNRWA, the UNRWA, the UN Relief Agency for Palestinian refugees, which Israel has sought to defund, to explain to high representatives of BRICS 10 the cataclysmic humanitarian situation in Gaza, as described by the UNRWA Commissioner General Filippo Lazzarini. In short, serious political business is already being conducted outside of the corrupted UN system as the United Nations disintegrates into a corporate shell, with the U.S. dictating all terms as the largest shareholder. Yet another key example of the BRICS as the new UN, Russian Security Council Chairman Nikolai Patrushev met in St. Petersburg with his Chinese counterpart Chen Wenqing on the sidelines of the 12th International Security Summit, congregating over 100 nations, including the security heads of BRICS 10 members, Iran, India, Brazil, and South Africa, as well as Iraq. The SCO security show, but the key crossroads these past few days was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, Defense Summit in Astana, Kazakhstan. For the first time, the new Chinese Defense Minister, Dang Jun, met with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Shoigu, to emphasize the comprehensive strategic partnership. Dang significantly stressed the, quote, dynamic, unquote, nature of China-Russia military interaction, while Shoigu doubled down, saying it sets a model for interstate relations based on mutual respect and shared strategic interests. Addressing the full SCO assembly, Shoigu emphatically refuted the massive Western propaganda drive about a Russian, quote, threat, unquote, to NATO. Everybody was at the SCO defense ministers meeting, including at the same table India, Iran, Pakistan, and also Belarus as an observer. Minsk is eager to join the SCO. The interlocking Russia, Iran, China strategic partnerships were totally in sync. Apart from Dang meeting Shoigu, he also met the Iranian Defense Minister, Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Ashtiani, who lavishly praised Beijing's condemnation of the Israeli terror airstrike in Damascus. What is happening now between Beijing and Tehran is a replay of what started last year between Moscow and Tehran, when a member of the Iranian delegation on a visit to Russia remarked that both parties had agreed on a mutual high-level, quote, anything you need, unquote, relationship. Very significant, that. Anything you need relationship between Moscow and Iran. In Astana, Dang's support for Iran was unmistakable. Not only did he invite Ashtiani to a security conference in Beijing, mirroring the Iranian position, he also called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Shoigu meeting with Ashtiani provided extra context when he recalled that, quote, the joint fight against international terrorism in Syria is a vivid example of our long-standing friendly relations, unquote. The Russian defense minister then delivered his clincher, quote, the current military political situation, threats to our states oblige us to common approaches to building a just world order based on equality for all participants in the international community. A new global security order. Establishing a new global security order, sorry about that, is right at the heart of BRICS 10 planning, on a par with the de-dollarization debate. All of this is anathema to the collective West, which is incapable of understanding the multifaceted, intertwined Russia, Iran, and China partnerships. What's happening here? Let me get this. I can't get my yellow pencil here. Oh, here it is. I just want to repeat that. Establishing a new global security offer is right at the heart of BRICS 10 planning. On a par with the de-dollarization debate, all of this is anathema to the collective West, which is incapable of understanding the multifaceted, intertwined Russia, Iran, and China partnerships. And that is a theme we'll hear a lot from Pepe Escobar going forward. In the interview we'll get to later, he emphasizes the nature of the strategic partnerships with respect to Russia and China, how comprehensive they are, and how the parties are trying to construct similar partnerships, with Iran. Very tight coupling of these three nations coming up. After the interaction goes on in person, Russian President Vladimir Putin will be visiting Beijing later this month. On Gaza, the Russian-Iran-China position is in complete sync. Israel is committing genocide. For the EU and NATO stand as a whole, this is not a genocide. The bloc supports Israel no matter what. After Iran on the 13th of April changed the game in West Asia for good, without even using their finest hypersonic missiles, the key question for the global majority is stark. In the end, who will restrain the genocidals and how? But diplomatic sources hint this will be discussed face to face by Putin and Xi. As one Chinese scholar with unique aplomb remarks, quote, "This time the barbarians are facing a 5,000-year continuing written civilization armed with Sun Tzu's art of war, Mao's thought, Xi's dual circulation strategy, Belt and Road, BRICS, the renminbi, digitalization, Russia and China unlimited, the world's most powerful manufacturing industry, tech supremacy, economic powerhouse, and the backing of the global South." I should put that in yellow too, because that's another very, very important statement. All that against the polarized hegemon in turmoil with its genocidal aircraft carrier in West Asia, that's Israel, for those who don't recognize the metaphor here, totally spinning out of control. U.S. threats of a clear choice between ending several key strands of the Russia-China strategic partnership or facing a sanctions tsunami. Don't cut it in Beijing. The same applies to Washington's wishful attempts at preventing BRICS members from ditching the dollar. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made it quite clear that Moscow and Beijing have nearly reached the point of abandoning the US dollar in bilateral trade. And the outright theft of Russian assets by the collective West is the ultimate red line for BRICS and all of the nations watching with horror as a whole. This is definitely a, quote, non-agreement capable, unquote, empire, as Lavrov has been emphasizing since late 2021. Yaroslav Lisavalik, founder of BRICS Plus Analytics, dismisses the hegemon's thrust against BRICS as the roadmap toward an alternative payment system is still in its infancy. As for Russia-China trade, the non-dollar high-speed train has already left the station. Yet the key question remains, how will Russia around China, RIC, the RIC. As BRICS leaders, SCO members, and simultaneously top three, quote, existential threats, unquote, to the hegemon, be able to start implementing a new global security architecture without staring down, okay, the genocidals? Well, I guess the way I would answer that question is I think they're already starting to stare down, okay, the genocidals. Obviously, in the earlier part of this stream, Russia was staring down, okay, the genocidals and saying, thus far and no further. The next step is tactical nukes for you. And Iran just stared down Israel, showed Israel there's no part of Israel that can be defended against the Iranian hypersonic missiles. And the next time, they'll be coming in full force. So the staring down, okay, has now begun. And I imagine with China doing some staring down now, maybe not to the too far distant future, okay, with respect to Taiwan. But that remains to be seen. It's speculation at this point. But I think Pepe has sketched a pretty clear picture here, okay, of how the security area is likely to develop. And to review the title, The Russian-Iran-China Search for a New Global Security Order. That search is going to continue. I think it's also going to be successful. It's going to involve some staring down, as Pepe very creatively indicated. Now, let me look at, hang on a second. Let me just stop sharing this. Oh, I see. Okay. So, K checks in at 9:53 and says hi to everybody. I'm going to see if there's anything here I have to answer. Surprisingly, there are no questions, which surprises me because this was a really, really important stream, I thought. Andy says, I just now was able to log on. Greetings, everyone. Folding 4 laundry baskets, so I'll just be listening rather diligently. So it's now 1:08. I've been on for an hour and 10 minutes or thereabouts. I guess I'm still going to go to Nima's video that had very, very important elements in it from Pepe Escobar. So let me share that right now, since there are not many questions. The title of this stream is Putin and China issuing stern warning to the United States, according to Pepe Escobar. So let's go through this. It's a rather long video, but I'll go through it with some comments and try to pick up the jewels here.
Strategic nuclear forces, and they're talking about the Navy getting involved and getting prepared for any sort of escalations. At the same time, we've heard that in France, in Britain, and in the United States, they're talking about putting troops on the ground. And how do you see the current phase of the war in Ukraine? Are we going to have some sort of new escalations, or the case of Ukraine is already done?
Okay, let's start. Nima, it's a pleasure to be with you, first of all. I am speaking from NATO stan, as I describe it. I am in France, in Brittany. The sea is on my left. You cannot see it. You see a little bit of trees around. I'm recharging my batteries. I'm about to hit the road for 6 months, practically nonstop. I just came from a huge trip in Brazil. Breaks.
Just to add, I believe that Pepe is a 71-year-old guy about to embark on a 6-month trip of almost continuous travel to cover various things, the most important developments in 2024 in terms of the BRICS. So yeah, he needs to recharge his batteries.
Remember? And your question is excellent because you asking the question just like a few minutes ago. Xi Jinping was at the Élysée Palace talking to the guy I always refer to as Le Petit Roi, the little king, who thinks that he is somebody of importance in the order of things in the new world, and it's not. Well, the level of desperation, not only in the big capitals in Europe, but especially in Brussels, in the different levels that Brussels works, the uppermost level is, of course, NATO. Then we have the subordinates, the European Union and the European Commission.
He did not mention the other member of the Troika, specifically the European Central Bank, very important member of the Troika, but he ranks these as below NATO.
They're absolutely desperate because those with a brain in all these institutions have already seen that NATO's cosmic humiliation in the black soil of Novorossiya is just around the corner.
Okay, Novorossiya, for those who don't know, that's translation, okay, New Russia. It refers to the areas that Catherine the Great conquered back in 1776, and which was a part of Russia until they were given to the Ukraine at the end of the Second World War as part of the settlement. But so it's not really so new Russia, but it was continuously Russia until relatively recent times. And it's culturally Russian, that area, and the majority inhabitants of that part, of Ukraine, are Russians. And those are the provinces the provinces in Donbass, that the Russians have been fighting for. And of course, there are two other very important provinces there, but they'll probably go to 4 more of the oblasts before the war is over. But 2 of those oblasts are Odessa, of course, and also Kharkov, known to the Ukrainians as Kharkiv. But anyway, that's what we're talking about when we say Novorossiya and the humiliation of the West in Novorossiya.
And that has been explained over and over again by virtually every important member of the Putin administration, which, by the way, is going to be renewed this week. The new Russian government is in effect this week, more or less simultaneously with Victory Day, May 9th, commemorated all across Russia. So Putin, Nebenzia at the UN, Lavrov, Medvedev, Patrushev, everybody saying the same thing. The only thing to discuss is the modality of how Ukraine is going to be submitted. There's nothing else to discuss. And the mood in Moscow, and I'm back to Moscow by the end of this month. And of course, even when I'm away, I'm following it very, very closely. The mood in Moscow is, I would say, quite relaxed. They know that the war is already won. The details, of course, the devil in the details is how far will Russia go? How long will it take? Is it going to be this summer? Is it going to be before the end of the year? It's going to be beginning of 2025. As Shoigu, defense minister, was saying last year, look, SMO is going to end in 2025. He's on the record saying that. But it could be 2024 as well. So you can imagine the level of desperation from Washington, of course, all across NATO stan, including Poland, the Baltic Chihuahuas, everybody. Especially because what
The Baltic Chihuahuas, of course, are Estonia, Latvia, okay, and Lithuania, the Baltic countries, so small armed forces. He refers to them as the Chihuahuas. Okay. So I think that's just very funny.
But this particular democratic administration, which is a mix of absolute incompetence and 24/7 chaos.
I cannot but agree with that particular characterization. I can't believe the Democratic Party produced such an incompetent group of foreign policy functionaries. It is absolutely crazy. I have to note that other than Joe Biden himself, they came out of the Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party.
The NATO that they want is not NATO that exists today, where France and Germany are, let's say, the most important EU countries. Then they should be the most important NATO countries as well. What the Americans want is a NATO that is basically organized between Washington, London, Warsaw, the Baltic Chihuahuas, and Kiev.
So they want to create a NATO that basically skips Western Europe, which has previously been the heart of NATO. They want to skip and go to Eastern Europe. Somehow, I don't think that is a NATO that can counter Russia in any sense of defending Europe from Russia, if that is what is intended here. Nor can it be very effective in constituting a base for military or intelligence forces to somehow undermine the regime in Russia and undermine the Russian Federation, which of course has been their aim for some time.
And of course, the Kiev branch or branching out is collapsing by the day as we see it. And there's no plan B, because Project Ukraine was plan A. It was always plan A, even before Maidan 10 years ago.
Okay, that is a very correct sort of observation. That plan has been in existence for a very long time. And I think it's astonishing that there is no plan B. These stubborn and arrogant people who formulated plan A, they really formulated it a long time ago, probably sometime during the Clinton administration. It probably goes back that far, at least in broad outline. Okay, and certainly it goes back to the Obama administration. It's hard to believe that in all that time they never came up with a plan B, which of course might have been a plan to play nice in the sandbox with Russia instead of trying to overthrow it. This is very annoying and infuriating.
So what's going to replace, let's say, rump Ukraine, which is what we're going to have either 2024 or 2025? An accumulation of troops in Eastern Europe. And that's where Poland, Romania, the Baltic Chihuahuas come in. And for instance, Medvedev, who's a keen observer of the chessboard, and now for the past few months, where he's giving himself free rein to talk in a very blunt way that obviously Putin or Patrushev cannot, or Lavrov cannot. And he was basically saying, look, if you are discussing sending NATO troops, you already know that you have NATO troops in Ukraine, and some of them have already been exterminated or incinerated by Russian troops. We know where they are. If you're going to send more, you know what's going to happen. And if you're going to send more officially, starting with Le Petit Roi talking about 2,000 French troops, you're going to put yourself in the line of fire directly from Russia. So this is going to be a NATO against Russia war, a hot war, and no holds barred.
Okay. So Pepe, okay, is basically echoing. I wouldn't say that he's echoing, but basically giving the same analysis, okay, as Alexander gave, and as Scott Ritter was implying, okay, was suggesting, very strong reaction, okay, from Russia, okay, and this action was actually presaged, actually by the Medvedev statements. And Dmitry Medvedev is the former president of Russia. According to the Russian constitution, okay, it was necessary for Putin to retire from the presidency for a while. And the presidency went over to Dmitry Medvedev, okay, in that time. Okay, and then again to Putin. But the basic point here is that he's been part of the Putin scheme for all this time. He doesn't exactly speak for Putin. He's been perceived of late to be to the right of Putin and more aggressive than Putin. But the point is, he is very close to Putin and is Putin's likely successor still. So what he says is quite important. And when Pepe talks about his giving free rein to more aggressive remarks towards the West, that is very significant going on.
So obviously, there's nobody with a brain, once again, from Washington to Brussels and everything in between and all the way to Eastern Europe to understand the consequences of having NATO troops officially in Ukrainian territory. So it's crazy because it's always a dialogue between the totally irrational and the very rational Russian actors. Like the Chinese are rational, like the Iranians are rational. So the possibility of a diplomatic dialogue and everybody sitting on the same table and discussing indivisibility of security, which is what they would have been discussing since late 2021, as everybody knows, when the Russia sent letters to Washington and Brussels said, let's talk about security for everybody.
Very important point. The Russians emphasized at the end of 2021 the creation of a new security framework for everyone. Biden ignored them. The West ignored them. The invasion followed shortly thereafter. Very, very important to note that and to fit it into the context, okay, of all.
For all of you in Western Europe, for Eastern Europe, for the post-Soviet space, and for us in Russia. And we all know that there was no answer. There was a non-response response, and that's why we are in this situation now. So the fact that desperation row, let's put it this way, is the mood prevailing from Washington to Brussels, could lead some of them to make something extreme, even more irrational than they are at the moment, which would be to send NATO troops from 2, 3, or 4 countries officially to Ukraine, on top of the current military exercises, which involve tens of thousands of troops, a NATO exercise, which is basically a sort of essay for a direct hot war confrontation against Russia.
So this emphasizes how stupid Congress was to continue the funding of $61 billion. Let those funds go to Ukraine when these Western countries are beginning to contemplate sending NATO's own troops into Ukraine, creating that escalation, a direct confrontation of NATO and Russia with nuclear war in the very close background. That's how stupid your Congress was. That's how much this whole idiot Congress deserves to be replaced in the coming election in 2024. They put us all at risk with their total stupidity and their high level of ignorance. Pepe characterizes the United States and its decision makers, as irrational compared to the rationality of China, the rationality of Russia, and the rationality, of Iran. Notice how he's talking about the rationality of the fundamentalist Iranians, the rationality of the mullahs. I mean, it's just incredible. The mullahs are coldly rational, and we in the secular West are wedded to our ideological dogmas and cannot run a rational foreign policy.
Put this all together, it's total madness. But it's impossible to instill a measure of common sense to the so-called political leaderships, either in Washington or the military political leadership in Brussels, which runs the whole Brussels show, because from the beginning, they cornered themselves into their own plan A without plan B, which is we're going to throw Russia out of SWIFT, we're going to destroy the Russian economy, and our NATO-armed Ukraine army is going to destroy the pitiful Red Army. They never saw.
And now, of course, we see the results. We see the idiocy of the assumptions, the idiocy of thinking that way. It was pretty apparent at the time also. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the Russians were too strong. On the other hand, there have been some surprises. I don't know if any of us anticipated quite the actual strength of the Russian economy in the face of sanctions. But still, it hasn't been that big a surprise if you reflect on the leadership of Putin, of Russia, over these many years and his careful planning in restoring Russian strength right in front of us, and we were completely unaware of that. Evidently, our U.S. planners and foreign policy geniuses, often referred to by people like, say, Ray McGovern, as the sophomores in the White House.
Thought that reality would dictate otherwise, like it did. And now, in this crucial year where we have, in parallel, the internal organization of BRICS 10, all the way to the summit in Kazan in October, and American elections in November, where we all know what could happen to the Democrats under that cadaver at the White House. No wonder they're absolutely desperate. So we see this popping now almost on an everyday level. We need to send troops to Ukraine. Oh, if Ukraine collapses, we all collapse. Oh, if Ukraine collapses, it's the end of Western civilization. If Ukraine collapses, NATO collapses, the EU collapses, everything collapses. So that's why we hear that every day. And it's going to be like this from now on, unfortunately.
In your opinion, how much of this rhetoric comes from 2024 presidential election in the United States? Because it seems that Democrats are so desperate with the conflict in Ukraine and also the conflict in Gaza. They're losing a lot in the United States. How do you see this type of, do you think that plays an important role in this continuation of the conflict in Ukraine?
There's no question, Nima. And of course, these are forever wars. They are completely interlinked and intertwined. What we see in Novorossiya, which is a US war against Russia, a proxy war using Ukraine as cannon fodder, at the same time, a NATO war against Russia, and at the same time, a three-level war, in fact. It's a war by the US against Russia. It's the war by US against Europe to vassalize Europe for the foreseeable future.
Now, that is a very significant point. We've already been successful in vassalizing Europe, who sat there and agreed to the severe damage that we did to them by destroying the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipelines. And they sat there and they took it, and they didn't break with the United States over that. Very, very strange. I think Pepe is very correct to point out that one of the things we've been doing in the war, in Ukraine, has been to weaken our vassals in Europe and further vassalize them to the point where they don't dare defy the United States.
And it's a war by the US against China because it interferes directly into new Silk Road corridors against Chinese trade going through Russia and through the post-Soviet space to Europe, part of.
And that point I haven't heard anybody make before, that the war in Ukraine strikes at the Belt and Road Initiative, and that it therefore strikes at China in that sense. I've seen many people point out that what the intention of the war was to weaken China by weakening and or destroying its ally Russia, and in that sense was an indirect attack on China. But Pepe is proposing here that it's also a direct attack on the Belt and Road Initiative and the whole China strategy to link up the various parts of the world island, specifically the whole Eurasian sphere going on.
Part of the new Silk Roads, interrelated economic corridors, etc. The problem is that the number one preoccupation of the people in power in Washington at the moment is the November elections. Everything that happens on the ground is subordinated to the elections, which they know, the ones with the brain, of course, that they already lost. They are trying to reverse in the next 6 or 7 months, which is practically impossible. And the war in Novorossiya at the same time connects to the genocide in Gaza, which is seen, interpreted, and horrifies 88% of the global population, the global majority, the global South, any way you want to define it. Eurasia, BRICS is expanded, basically global majority, which is the term that Lavrov himself has been using for a few months now. These wars are intertwined. What the Zionist project is doing, and without anybody being able to stop them in Gaza, could be canceled immediately by a phone call from Washington. Everybody knows that. And what do we have? We have the absolute reverse. We have the US and the EU and NATO directly supporting and endorsing genocide.
And isn't that insane? Isn't that totally insane that the nation that is responsible, most responsible for creating the Genocide Convention in the first place in the post-war period, and for defining the outlines of the horrors of this crime, defining the crime itself, is now supporting one of its allies in commissions of this worst of international crimes. It is a terrible irony of history that this nation, the United States, has sunk so low in its moral character that it would allow this to happen. And also, one can blame the few people in Washington implementing this, of course, but so many of our fellow citizens are supporting this that it doesn't bother them that we're supporting a genocide in Gaza.
This is something that is seen very clearly in any city in West Asia, anywhere in Central Asia, anywhere in Southeast Asia, anywhere in Africa, anywhere in Latin America.
The whole rest of the world sees that in Gaza, the emperor has no clothes. The emperor is naked.
Virtually all over the world. So we have the declining empire cornering itself on one side, with the NATO vassals like chihuahuas behind it, defending the Zionist project against virtually the whole planet, 88% of the planet. So obviously something's going to crack soon. There are many horrible scenarios that may happen. It could be.
I've stated, in other live streams, that one thing what could happen soon is during the attack, on Rafah, it is possible the Iranians might choose to unleash their missile forces on the Israeli settlers, in the West Bank in retaliation for the attack, on Rafah. The implications of a systematic attack, and remember, those Iranian missiles are very precise. They could hit the settlements without creating any damage for the Palestinian areas. They could hit them severely, denying the settlers security, which the Israeli state has guaranteed to them. That could result in a migration of the settlers to Ben Gurion Airport to go back where they came from. In other words, a Nakba in reverse. Such a Nakba, in reverse, could result in new conditions on the ground, leading to a negotiated settlement, because one barrier that remains to a negotiated settlement for two states, a two-state solution, in the Middle East, is the presence of 750,000 settlers in the West Bank Palestinian areas. If those 750,000 have gone home or gone to other areas, then the Palestinians could inhabit the area that was intended for them by the United Nations in 1947. Just saying.
Be a false flag in the next few months, basically to blame the three main BRICS: Russia, China, and Iran. These are the nations that are basically driving the BRICS path towards multipolarity. It could be something totally disproportional by Tel Aviv, which would force a response from Iran, which would be even more forceful than the previous one, which was extremely measured. It could be a concerted Washington-Tel Aviv play, once again, with facts on the ground or diverting from the facts on the ground in Gaza to once again corner the BRICS 10 majority, global majority. or something that could embarrass Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which are now part of BRICS. So there are many scenarios ahead. The only scenario that would not influence anything, in fact, is on Ukraine. The only thing left for NATO in Ukraine is actually to put their own troops there. That will be exterminated in a matter of weeks, maximum. And all.
By the way, Pepe is completely right about that. Scott Ritter frequently asserts, okay, this would be the case. Colonel McGregor thinks, okay, it would be the case. Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern, all sorts of commentators on this think that if they sent even appreciable number of troops into the ground war, they would be eliminated relatively quickly by the superior arms, the superior numbers, the artillery, especially the overwhelming air power that Russia has, okay, in that area, and the missile and drone power they can deploy in that area. It would be suicide for the NATO troops, okay, to attack. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that the military generals of NATO have a realistic understanding of what the Russians are capable of doing, unless they've been studying the facts on the ground in Ukraine since the war started and the gradual building of Russian power. They would not have a proper understanding of what Russia can do to new NATO forces going into Ukraine to fight for the Ukrainians.
The new Wunderwaffen, F-16s, whatever. Nothing will change the dynamics on the battlefield.
The Wunderwaffen are the wonder weapons. That's German for wonder weapons. Wunderwaffen.
So no, once again, we come back to the beginning of our discussion. Desperation mounts when we see what's left of rational players across what I call NATO stand, looking at the possibilities ahead. So that's it, basically. A false flag, or basically a false flag or a series of false flags, and something in Gaza that will be a provocation. And that would absolutely, the consequence would be a hardcore Iranian response, and then we have a hot war all across West Asia. So that's why all of us we are following it.
Okay, so I must comment on that because Pepe thinks that what could happen is that we would have some incidents that would cause a hot war, okay, in all of Asia. Now that might apply to the Iranian retaliation, okay, I was talking about. But on the other hand, if the Iranian retaliation was such that it was absolutely crippling to the settlers and drove them out, the chaos in Israel that was created by that might be such to paralyze, okay, the Israelis from starting a general regional war. They would have too much chaos to contend with inside, okay, of the occupied areas. It would result also in the fall of the regime. They would not continue behind the Netanyahu regime in that kind of situation. And the next regime might be more capable of rational discussion and rational responses. What the Iranians would be doing would be, they already demonstrated that all of Israel would be open to their retaliation if they chose that course. But if they choose their power now, they choose to use their power now to divert the Israelis from from Rafah, further attacks, on Gaza. Whether that would further widen the war or not depends on the chaos that occurred, in Israel. If they attacked both the settlements and also provided considerable damage to Tel Aviv and to Haifa, I don't think it's clear what exactly the Israelis would do in that particular situation. They would be tempted to use the nuclear weapons, of course, but in that kind of a crisis situation, the Russians would certainly threaten to use their nukes in reply. And as powerful as the Israelis are with respect to a nuclear deterrent, the assumptions of their having one did not intend to encompass a possible nuclear war with Russia. So, I'm just saying, the possibilities produced by such an attack, by the Iranians are quite profound and might result in facts on the ground that totally change the situation in the Middle East.
Carefully. We are in a state of suspension of disbelief in terms of anything absolutely crazy could happen at any moment. Considering the impossibility of a dialogue between the irrationals on one side and the rational players on the other side.
There are a lot of people out there criticizing.
Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. It's now 10:49. I've been here on this program since 9 o'clock, and I was on Dee's program from 8 to 9. So I've been around for 2 hours and 49 minutes. I think it's enough. I will come back tomorrow night with the rest of this video and my commentary upon it. I think it's proving to be very clarifying, at least for me, to clarify my own thoughts about the world situation as Pepe goes through it systematically. And tomorrow night, I'll come back with further, very close analysis of this important video from Nima Al-Rashid, and Pepe Escobar. And depending on happenings today, I might have some more to say, as well. But I figured that it's probably going to take me at least an hour to go through the rest of this video. So that would be from 8 to 9, tomorrow. I know I go on at 8, tomorrow. So certainly that would fill that hour. If I decide to cover something else tomorrow, I might go for longer than that, but we will just have to see. But for now, I'm going to look at your comments, and I'm going to wind up this video at this point. So here we are. Let me stop the screen. And we get some highs. I still have very small attendance today. I don't know why this is the case. My attendance had been going up for some time, and especially in the IR programs, it was getting up to the 20s, the high teens to 20s, 25 or so. I don't know why it's so low today. It may be because there are some other very important things that are going on. But anyway, there's a comment from Andy saying, realistically, it was the Russians that really liberated the Jews and defeated, the Nazis. The U.S. was actually conducting business with the Nazis under Prescott Bush. So it makes sense that the U.S. would support these Zion Nazis. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. To me, it doesn't, make a lot of sense. I think there's been considerable moral decay among the leaders of the West caused by neoliberalism and the commitment, okay, to neoliberalism and the decline of collective values, okay, in the West, and all the short-run pragmatism and instrumental thinking that has gone on in the West for such a very long time. I think that's what's at play here. And I don't think the U.S. doing business with the Nazis under Prescott Bush is really much of a factor, though it is the same. It's the product of certainly that same kind of thinking. I do agree with that. So, thank you for that comment, Andy. I think that ends this stream for the day. Again, I will be back tomorrow, but at 8 p.m. And I will be back at least to finish the interview, okay, with Pepe, and to do analysis and commentary, okay, on that. So thank you for coming tonight. I will end this stream here, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks again.